My rich husband cheated on me, saying no one would want me, until a more powerful man appeared. The grand chandelier above the ballroom cast shimmering golden light across the sea of elegantly dressed guests. A soft murmur of laughter and conversation filled the air, blending with the distant sound of a classical symphony. At the center of it all stood a woman, poised and graceful, her emerald gown hugging her slender frame. To everyone in the room, she was the epitome of wealth and sophistication, the devoted wife of a powerful businessman. Yet, beneath her composed smile, a deep loneliness gnawed at her heart. She had spent years trying to be the perfect wife, supporting her husband through every business endeavor, attending every gala by his side, and sacrificing pieces of herself to fit into the pristine image he demanded. Tonight, as he mingled effortlessly with investors, barely acknowledging her presence, she felt more like an accessory than a partner. She reached for a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, her fingers trembling slightly. Across the room, her husband, Andrew Kensington, stood surrounded by a group of men who hung onto his every word. Tall, charismatic, and impeccably dressed, he was the kind of man who commanded attention effortlessly. Once upon a time, she had been mesmerized by that confidence, drawn into his world of luxury and prestige. But over the years, the warmth in his voice when he spoke to her had turned cold, his affection replaced with indifference. She could still recall the early days of their marriage, when he would surprise her with handwritten notes and spontaneous trips to the coast. Now, he barely spared her a glance unless it was to correct something about her appearance or remind her of her place. As she sipped her champagne, a familiar voice broke through her thoughts. "Darling, fix your posture." Andrew's voice was smooth yet laced with quiet condescension. She straightened instinctively, years of habit ingrained in her bones. "And do try to look more engaged. This is an important night." Without waiting for a response, he turned back to his conversation, laughing heartily at some joke she hadn't heard. The men around him exchanged knowing smirks, their eyes briefly flickering toward her before dismissing her just as easily. Heat crept up her neck, but she swallowed her embarrassment, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. She excused herself and made her way toward the balcony, inhaling the crisp night air as she tried to steady her thoughts. How had her life become this? Once, she had dreamed of a marriage filled with love and respect, yet here she was, silenced, sidelined, and slowly fading into the background of her own life. A small voice in her head whispered that this was not the life she deserved. But what choice did she have? She had built everything around Andrew. If she walked away, she would have nothing. As she stared into the darkness beyond the city lights, she had no idea that the cracks in her marriage were about to widen into an abyss she could no longer ignore. The morning after the gala, she woke to the sound of the shower running. Andrew always woke before her, his routine meticulously planned down to the minute. She stretched beneath the silky sheets, staring at the ceiling as the events of the night before replayed in her mind. The stares. The whispers. The way Andrew had barely acknowledged her presence except to correct her. It had become so routine that she almost didn't feel the sting anymore. Almost. She turned to the side, catching sight of his phone on the nightstand. It vibrated once, then again. A name flashed across the screen. At first, she thought she had read it wrong, but as the device buzzed a third time, she felt a sickening twist in her stomach. It was a woman's name, one she didn't recognize. Her pulse quickened as she hesitated, battling with herself over whether she should reach for it. A part of her already knew the answer to the question she was afraid to ask. The water shut off. She barely had time to move before Andrew emerged from the bathroom, a towel draped loosely around his waist. He walked past her without a word, picking up his phone and swiping the screen with practiced ease. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his lips before he typed out a quick response. "You're up early," he finally said, his voice devoid of any real interest. "Couldn't sleep," she murmured, watching him closely. He didn't press further. Instead, he moved to the closet, selecting his suit with the same efficiency he did every morning. She sat up, gripping the sheets. "Andrew, is there something you need to tell me?" The question left her lips before she could stop it. He didn't even turn around. "If there was, you'd already know." The dismissal was sharp, cold. And with that, the conversation was over before it had even begun. Days passed, but the unease in her chest only grew heavier. Andrew's behavior became more distant, his late nights more frequent. He claimed he was working, but she no longer believed him. The distance between them was no longer just emotional, it was physical, tangible. The next event on their calendar was a high-profile business dinner, one where she knew she would once again be expected to play the doting wife. The restaurant was luxurious, filled with men in tailored suits and women in designer dresses. She sat beside Andrew, her fingers curled tightly around the stem of her wine glass. The conversation flowed around her, the men discussing deals, investments, and power plays. She tried to contribute once, only for Andrew to wave a dismissive hand. "Let's leave business talk to those who understand it," he said smoothly, earning chuckles from the table. Her cheeks burned, but she forced a smile. As if that wasn't enough, the woman across the table, a socialite known for her sharp tongue, leaned in with a syrupy tone. "You're lucky, you know. Most men with Andrew's success don't bother keeping their first wives around for long." Laughter erupted. Andrew didn't defend her. He didn't even look at her. He simply smirked, as if amused by the remark. Something inside her cracked. That night, she waited. Andrew returned home late, as expected, loosening his tie as he walked into their bedroom. "You're still up?" he asked, surprised. She was seated on the edge of the bed, her phone in hand. Her heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "Who is she?" His expression barely changed. If anything, he looked bored. "I don't know what you're talking about." She turned the phone screen toward him. The messages were there, clear, undeniable. Andrew sighed, rubbing his temple. "You shouldn't go looking for things that will upset you," he said. Rage boiled inside her. "So it's true." "Does it matter?" he shot back, his tone laced with indifference. "I provide for you. You have everything. Stop acting like this changes anything." Everything inside her shattered. "You'll never find better than me," Andrew said, buttoning his cuffs as if they were discussing the weather. She gripped the edge of the vanity, her knuckles white. "You think I'll just accept this?" He smirked. "What choice do you have? You built your entire life around me. You leave, you get nothing. No status. No money. No future." She swallowed the lump in her throat. Andrew grabbed his jacket and turned to leave. "If you're smart, you'll stop making a fuss." The door closed behind him. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. She was furious. The days following Andrew's betrayal felt like moving through a dense fog. She no longer cared to pretend. The weight of his words clung to her, "You'll never find better than me." The arrogance in his voice, the certainty that she would stay, only fueled the fire burning in her chest. One afternoon, as she sat alone in the vast yet empty mansion, she heard the front door open. Andrew walked in, his presence as imposing as ever, but she no longer saw him as the untouchable figure he believed himself to be. He set down his briefcase, loosened his tie, and glanced at her with indifference. "I'll have the papers drawn up soon," he said casually, as if discussing business. "You'll get what I decide is fair. Don't fight it. You won't win." Her fingers clenched into fists at her sides. "Fair?" she echoed, voice steady despite the storm within her. "You expect me to just walk away with nothing while you continue parading around with your mistress?" He exhaled sharply, as if already bored of the conversation. "You were taken care of because of me," he replied coolly. "You have no career, no assets, nothing of your own. Do yourself a favor, sign the papers, move on, and be grateful I'm even offering you anything." She stared at him, disgust rising in her throat. How had she once loved this man? The realization hit her hard. Andrew had never respected her. To him, she had been nothing more than an extension of his image, a possession he had grown tired of. And now, he expected her to disappear quietly, as if she had never mattered at all. The divorce proceedings were as ruthless as she had expected. Andrew, a man accustomed to winning, made it his mission to strip her of everything. His legal team bombarded her with papers, clauses, and threats. If she contested the settlement, she would walk away with nothing. She had once believed she would fight, but as the days stretched into weeks, exhaustion settled deep in her bones. Every lawyer she spoke to warned her Andrew had resources, connections, and an image to protect. He wouldn't let her win. "You signed a prenuptial agreement," one attorney told her, flipping through the pages of her past decisions. "There's not much we can do. If we push too hard, he'll bury you in legal fees until you can't keep up." Her hands trembled as she gripped the document in front of her. Years of marriage, of sacrifices, reduced to cold, impersonal legal jargon. She had given everything to this life, and now, she was being discarded like an outdated accessory. The house, the cars, the financial security, gone. The bank accounts she once had access to were frozen. She found herself standing in an empty apartment, far from the marble floors and crystal chandeliers she had once called home. The silence was deafening. She had been abandoned, left with only the clothes in her suitcase and the harsh reality that she had nothing to fall back on. Andrew had taken everything. And yet, for the first time, something inside her whispered, "Good." Because now, she had nothing left to lose. Wealth had a way of attracting people, but the moment it was gone, so were they. She learned that quickly. The so-called friends who had once clung to her at galas, laughing at her jokes and admiring her lifestyle, suddenly had no time for her. Calls went unanswered, messages were ignored. "I'm so sorry you're going through this," one woman had said in a hushed tone at a boutique, barely looking at her. I can't be caught in the middle of this, you understand, right?" Another friend, someone she had confided in for years, simply shrugged. "These things happen. Maybe it's for the best." No one wanted to be associated with a woman who had lost her status. She had always known the social circles she had been a part of were shallow, but experiencing their cruelty firsthand was a new kind of pain. The whispers followed her, how quickly she had fallen, how Andrew had upgraded to someone younger, someone more worthy. She wanted to scream that they were wrong, that she had been more than just a wife, more than just Andrew Kensington's possession. But would they even care? Doubtful. They had never seen her as an individual, only as the woman standing beside a powerful man. And now that she stood alone, she was invisible. She walked through the city streets, surrounded by people yet utterly alone. But she refused to let their rejection break her. She would rebuild. She just didn't know how yet. The weight of it all crashed down on her one evening as she sat on the floor of her small, dimly lit apartment. Bills piled up on the counter, the savings she had managed to keep dwindling faster than she had anticipated. She had never handled finances before, Andrew had made sure of that. Now, she was left trying to figure out how to survive. Job applications were met with rejection after rejection. Her resume was blank. Years spent managing household staff and hosting charity events meant nothing in the real world. Employers didn't care about the prestige of her last name. She was just another woman looking for work, and she had nothing to offer. The humiliation was suffocating. She thought about calling her parents, but the shame of admitting she had failed held her back. She couldn't bear the idea of hearing "I told you so" from the people who had warned her against marrying Andrew. So she suffered in silence. Nights were the hardest. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Andrew's voice echoing in her mind. "You'll never find better than me." He had said it with such certainty. Was he right? Was she really so incapable, so worthless without him? The thought made her stomach turn. She curled into herself, gripping the sheets tightly. She refused to believe this was how her story ended. She sat in a crowded cafe, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she could barely afford. Around her, people chatted, laughter and conversations blending together. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel entirely suffocated by her thoughts. She was just another face in the crowd, unnoticed and unimportant. It should have felt miserable, but strangely, it was freeing. No more pretending. No more forced smiles at events she hated. She could just be. She exhaled slowly, trying to shake the weight of everything pressing down on her. That was when it happened. A man, tall, composed, with an air of quiet authority, walked past her table. It was only for a brief second, but their eyes met. He hesitated, as if recognizing her from somewhere, then offered the smallest nod before continuing on. Something about his presence sent a shiver down her spine. Not in fear, but in awareness. She didn't know who he was. But in that moment, for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost, hope. She couldn't shake the feeling. The man from the cafe, there was something about him. It wasn't just his presence, which radiated quiet confidence. It was the way he had looked at her, as if seeing something in her that she no longer saw in herself. She tried to push it from her mind, but later that evening, as she walked home through the cold city streets, she spotted him again. He stood outside an office building, speaking with someone in a sharp navy suit. The polished glass doors behind him reflected the bustling nightlife, but he stood still, a pillar of composure in the chaos. Before she could stop herself, she slowed her pace. As if sensing her presence, he turned, his piercing gaze meeting hers once more. This time, there was recognition. He studied her, his expression unreadable, and then, in a move that both unnerved and intrigued her, he nodded slightly, acknowledging her presence. The interaction lasted no more than a few seconds, but it left her heart pounding. Who was he? And why did it feel like he had just seen right through her? The next morning, she walked into a modest office building, clutching her resume with trembling fingers. She had applied to dozens of places, desperate for any job, but rejection had become routine. This interview was her last chance before her savings ran dry. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves as she approached the receptionist. "I'm here for the assistant position," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. The woman behind the desk gave her a brief glance before checking the schedule. "Take a seat," the receptionist instructed. She obeyed, gripping her folder tightly as she scanned the room. The walls were lined with sleek, modern decor, the company's name etched in silver across the glass panels. Kensington & Locke Financial. She had heard of them, one of the most powerful firms in the city. But what were the odds of actually landing a job here? She was lost in thought when a familiar voice called her name. Her head snapped up, and her stomach clenched as she locked eyes with him. The man from the cafe. The man who had looked at her like he knew exactly who she was. She was too stunned to speak. He approached, his posture effortlessly commanding, his presence demanding attention without a single word. "Follow me," he said, not unkindly. Confused but too shocked to argue, she obeyed, trailing him through the glass-walled corridors. Her mind raced. Was he the hiring manager? Or worse, had he somehow recognized her as Andrew Kensington's discarded wife? If that was the case, this interview was already doomed. He led her into a spacious office, its walls lined with bookshelves and city skyline views. "Sit," he instructed, settling behind his desk. She hesitated but obeyed, gripping the armrests tightly. "You're overqualified for the assistant position," he stated, flipping through her resume. Her breath caught. Overqualified? Every other employer had treated her as if she had nothing to offer. "You were deeply involved in high-profile fundraising, handled PR at social events, and coordinated major charity functions." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "That isn't nothing. You just don't know your worth yet." The words hit her harder than she expected. For the first time in months, someone saw her as more than Andrew's forgotten wife. The job offer came as a shock. It wasn't for the assistant position she had applied for. He offered her a role in the firm's strategic partnerships department, an area that required someone with an understanding of high-net-worth clients and corporate relations. She hesitated, her mind still tangled in self-doubt. "I don't know if I'm qualified for this," she admitted. He didn't react, merely studying her for a long moment. "You learn fast," he finally said. "You understand people. And you're desperate enough to prove yourself. That's enough for me." She should have been offended by his bluntness, but instead, she felt something unfamiliar: respect. He wasn't offering her a job out of pity. He expected her to rise to the challenge. The first few weeks were grueling. She was thrown into meetings with executives, tasked with analyzing corporate relationships, and expected to navigate the complexities of business politics. But as the days passed, something shifted. She wasn't just surviving, she was excelling. And with every success, the version of herself that Andrew had tried to destroy began to fade. Months passed, and she transformed. The woman who had once been humiliated, discarded, and left to struggle was now thriving in a corporate world that she had never imagined herself in. Her boss, the man who had first recognized her potential, remained a mystery. His name was Nicholas Locke, and while he was known for his sharp business acumen, he was also infamous for keeping his personal life completely private. He never entertained meaningless small talk, never wasted words. And yet, he had taken a chance on her. One evening, as she packed up her desk, Nicholas appeared at her office door. "You're coming with me to an event this Saturday," he stated. She blinked, caught off guard. An event? He handed her an invitation, the Kensington Foundation annual gala. Her heart stopped. Andrew's event. "You want me to go there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Nicholas said simply. It's time you stopped running from your past. And I want them to see exactly what they lost. The night of the gala arrived sooner than she was ready for. As she stepped out of the sleek black car, the golden lights of the grand ballroom illuminated her path. The last time she had attended this event, she had been standing beside Andrew, her presence unnoticed, her voice silenced. But tonight, everything was different. Her dress, a deep sapphire blue, hugged her figure elegantly, confidence radiating from her in a way she never thought possible. Beside her, Nicholas stood tall, exuding power and composure, his presence both grounding and overwhelming. The murmurs began the moment they stepped through the entrance, whispers of shock, curiosity, and, most satisfyingly, envy. Andrew was already inside, entertaining guests, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his signature smirk in place. But as he turned and saw her, that smirk faltered. His eyes darkened with something she couldn't quite place, anger, disbelief, or maybe even regret. He had expected her to fade away, to crumble under the weight of his betrayal. Instead, she had walked back into his world, not as a discarded wife, but as someone untouchable, someone beyond his control. Nicholas, standing beside her, offered a subtle nod of approval. "Let them see you," he murmured. And so she did. The room buzzed with energy as they moved through the crowd. Old acquaintances who had once dismissed her now greeted her with feigned enthusiasm, their smiles strained as they struggled to comprehend how she had risen from the ashes. She played the part well, calm, poised, unaffected. But the real satisfaction came when Andrew finally approached. "Quite the entrance," he said, his voice laced with forced amusement. His gaze flickered to Nicholas, sizing him up. "Didn't expect to see you here." Nicholas barely spared him a glance. "Your expectations have no bearing on my decisions," he replied smoothly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Andrew clenched his jaw but quickly masked his irritation. "Didn't think you'd show your face again," he said to her, his tone condescending. She met his gaze, unwavering. "And yet, here I am," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Thriving." The word hit its mark, the flicker of something bitter flashing across his face. For the first time, he had no control over the narrative. As the night progressed, she found herself engaged in conversations with powerful figures, CEOs, investors, individuals who once wouldn't have given her a second glance. But now, with Nicholas beside her, her presence carried weight. She spoke with confidence, not as Andrew's ex-wife, but as a woman who had rebuilt herself. The respect she once begged for was now given freely, not out of obligation, but because she had earned it. At one point, a familiar voice interrupted. "You've changed." She turned to see one of Andrew's longtime business associates, a man who had once dismissed her as nothing more than a trophy wife. Now, he looked at her with genuine curiosity. "Perhaps," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Or maybe I was always this person. You just never cared to notice." The satisfaction of watching realization dawn on his face was unlike anything she had ever felt. As the night wore on, she and Nicholas found themselves alone on the balcony, the cool night air a stark contrast to the warmth of the ballroom. She exhaled, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. "That was surreal," she admitted. Nicholas, standing beside her, studied her for a moment. "You handled it well," he said simply. But there was something else in his tone, something she couldn't quite define. She turned to face him, searching his expression. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, genuinely curious. His jaw tightened slightly before he responded. Because you needed to see it, he said. You needed to see that you never needed him to define you. The words sent a shiver down her spine, not from fear, but from something dangerously close to admiration. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly seen. And it terrified her. The gala ended, but the impact of the night lingered. The next morning, as she sat in her office, scrolling through news articles covering the event, a headline caught her attention. Kensington Enterprises faces financial turmoil, stocks plummet amidst scandal. Her breath hitched. She clicked the article, scanning the text, her heart racing. Rumors of internal corruption, failed investments, and lawsuits had finally caught up to Andrew's empire. She leaned back in her chair, absorbing the reality of it. For years, Andrew had wielded power over her, made her believe she was nothing without him. But now, the very foundation he had built his arrogance upon was crumbling. And for the first time, she felt no sadness, no regret. Just a quiet, unshakable certainty: Andrew Kensington was no longer her problem. He had been so sure she would never find better. But as she glanced at the office door, where Nicholas stood watching her with an unreadable expression, she realized he had never been more wrong. News of Andrew's financial crisis spread like wildfire. Overnight, he went from a revered businessman to a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. Reports detailed reckless investments, legal disputes, and internal betrayals within his company. She read each article with quiet satisfaction, not out of vengeance, but because it confirmed what she had long suspected: Andrew's empire had always been built on illusions. His wealth had shielded him from consequences, but now, the walls were caving in. Her phone buzzed with messages from old acquaintances, people who had once distanced themselves, now suddenly eager to reconnect. "Did you hear about Andrew?" one read. "Bet he regrets everything now." She ignored them all. She had spent years living in his shadow, defined by his power. Now, she had her own life, her own worth. Andrew's destruction no longer concerned her. She had already left him behind. She hadn't expected to hear from him again. But one evening, as she left the office, her phone rang. The number was familiar, yet unexpected. She hesitated before answering. "We need to talk," Andrew's voice came through, stripped of its usual arrogance. There was something else in it now, something she had never heard before. Desperation. She almost laughed at the irony. Months ago, he had cast her aside, convinced she would crumble without him. Now, it was he who was struggling, his empire teetering on the edge of collapse. "There's nothing to talk about," she said, keeping her voice steady. He exhaled sharply. "You don't understand. They're turning against me. The board, investors, everyone." He hesitated. "I need your help." The sheer audacity of the request left her speechless. The man who had humiliated her, abandoned her, now wanted her to save him. She met him in a quiet corner of an upscale hotel lounge, curious but unaffected. Andrew looked different, tired, worn. The confidence he once carried so effortlessly was gone, replaced by tension and unease. "You look well," he said, his attempt at charm falling flat. She didn't bother responding. "I need someone I can trust," he continued, leaning forward. "Someone who understands how these people think. They're trying to push me out, and you," he hesitated. "You always had a way with people." She studied him for a long moment. Once, those words would have meant everything. Once, she would have given anything to feel needed by him. But now, they were empty. You didn't trust me when it mattered, she said, her voice calm. You made sure I had nothing. And now that you're the one losing everything, you suddenly remember my worth? His expression faltered. He had expected her to be bitter, but he had not expected indifference. She picked up her bag, standing to leave. I'm not your savior, Andrew. I never was. Andrew's downfall wasn't just a financial disaster, it became a public spectacle. The same people who had once flattered him now distanced themselves, eager to align with more powerful figures. He arrived at an exclusive industry gala, hoping to regain some influence, but the whispers started the moment he walked in. He wasn't the respected mogul anymore, he was a cautionary tale. She watched from across the room, unseen yet aware of every moment. She saw the way executives avoided him, how former allies turned their backs. And then, the final blow, security quietly approached, informing him that his invitation had been revoked. His face paled as realization dawned. He was no longer one of them. As he walked out, his shoulders stiff with humiliation, she felt no pity. Andrew Kensington had spent years believing he was untouchable. Now, he was learning what it meant to be powerless. Days after the gala, she sat in her office, reflecting on how far she had come. The woman she was now, independent, respected, felt like a stranger to the woman she had once been. Nicholas entered, placing a file on her desk, but instead of leaving, he hesitated. You did well at the gala, he said. You proved that you don't need anyone's validation. She met his gaze, sensing something deeper behind his words. He exhaled, his usual composed demeanor softening. There's something I want to ask you. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Her breath caught. This isn't about Andrew, he continued. This isn't about revenge or proving anything. This is about you. I've watched you rebuild yourself, piece by piece. And I don't want to stand on the sidelines anymore. He opened the box, a stunning ring glimmered inside. Marry me. It wasn't a demand, nor an expectation. It was a choice. And for the first time in her life, she had the power to decide. The weight of the moment settled over her like a slow, steady tide. Nicholas's proposal was unexpected, yet not entirely surprising. Over the past months, their partnership had evolved into something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. And yet, as she stared at the ring glistening in the dim light of her office, a familiar fear crept in. Marriage had once been a prison, a gilded cage that had stripped her of her identity. Could she truly open herself up to something new without the shadows of her past creeping in? She exhaled, her fingers twitching slightly before she met his gaze. Nicholas, the words tangled in her throat. He didn't look disappointed, nor did he rush her. Instead, he simply studied her, his usual composure unwavering. Take your time, he said, closing the box gently. I don't want you to say yes out of expectation. I want you to say yes because you want this. His words soothed something deep within her, but they didn't erase the doubts. She needed to be sure, not just of him, but of herself. She spent the following days in deep contemplation. Every moment with Nicholas replayed in her mind, the way he had challenged her, supported her, respected her in a way no man ever had. But love, real love, required trust, and trust had never come easily to her. One evening, as she walked through the city alone, she found herself outside the office building where her new life had begun. She stared up at the sleek structure, realizing just how far she had come from the woman who had once felt lost and discarded. The next day, Nicholas called her into his office, his expression unreadable. "Come with me," he said simply. She followed, confused, until they arrived at a private event space overlooking the skyline. A single table was set, candles flickering against the glass windows. "This isn't about the proposal," he clarified, as if reading her thoughts. "This is about you. About proving to you that this, us, isn't something meant to confine you. It's something meant to elevate you." The sincerity in his voice, the way he never demanded but instead offered, it shattered the last of her walls. That night, she finally understood. Love wasn't about losing herself, it was about being with someone who let her be more of who she truly was. But before she could make any decisions, she knew she needed to prove something to herself first. The next morning, she walked into Nicholas's office with a calm determination. "Before I answer you, I need to do something for myself," she said. He didn't interrupt, just nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I need to stand on my own. I need to build something that is mine before I share it with anyone else." Nicholas didn't argue. He simply leaned back in his chair, a small smirk playing on his lips. "I expected nothing less," he said. "So, what's your plan?" She exhaled, relief washing over her. "I want to start something of my own. A firm that helps women like me, women who have been overlooked, discarded, or underestimated. I want to give them the opportunities one never had." Nicholas's smirk widened. "Then let's make it happen." And just like that, she took the first step towards something that was truly hers. Building something from the ground up wasn't easy, but for the first time in her life, she welcomed the challenge. With Nicholas's guidance, not as a crutch, but as a mentor, she launched a consulting firm dedicated to empowering women in business. Within months, it gained traction, attracting clients who saw her as more than just Andrew Kensington's former wife. She was now a woman of power in her own right. The day her company's name was officially registered, Nicholas showed up at her office, leaning against the doorway with that knowing look. "You did it," he said simply. She smiled, feeling an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. "I did." He stepped forward, reaching into his pocket. "So now that you've built your own empire," he said, opening the familiar velvet box once again, "are you ready to share it with me?" This time, when she looked at the ring, there was no hesitation. No fear. Just certainty. "Yes," she whispered, and as Nicholas slid the ring onto her finger, she knew this was her choice, her love, her new beginning. Months later, she stood at the head of a grand conference room, addressing a group of powerful women who had once been overlooked, just as she had been. She spoke with confidence, her voice unwavering, no longer carrying the weight of past humiliations. Andrew's name was no longer a shadow that followed her, he had become nothing more than a footnote in a story that wasn't his to tell. His downfall had been inevitable, but hers had never been a downfall at all. It had been a rebirth. Later that evening, as she stepped into her home, she found Nicholas waiting for her, a glass of wine in hand, the warmth of their shared life wrapping around her like a comfort she had once believed was impossible. She had spent years searching for validation, for belonging. But in the end, she had found something far greater, herself. And as she looked around at the life she had built, she knew, without a doubt, that she had not only survived. She had won.